I took my L, I kept it pushing, I can't break for that. They tried to count me out, I told them it's too late for that.
I'm gonna welcome everyone who's in the room to the next session. And again, I'm Lauren Holland. I am one of the co-chairs of Wall Street Friends. I'm not gonna waste time introducing myself. So Shawn, I'm gonna turn it over to you to give yourself a brief introduction, and then we're just gonna get right into it from there.
Yeah, so Shawn Rochester, author of The Black Tax: Cost of Being Black in America, where I quantify the financial cost of discrimination against Black people. Chicago Booth MBA, chemical engineering, undergrad, University of Rochester. Did a bunch of work in strategy and M&A. I've experience in manufacturing, traveled all over the world. Been very, very engaged, in our community. Working with my wife with a nonprofit that put about $2 million into the hands of Black high schoolers that were going off to university, and now just really focusing on advocating for Black economic advancement and making and helping raise capital for businesses where it makes sense, and making investments where it makes sense.
Just for the people in the room, Shawn and I go way back. He's dope, obviously, because we have the whole chemical engineering booth thing going on. But we spoke probably a little over an hour earlier this week to kind of frame, because the context of his work and how we wanted to focus this discussion to make it relevant to those gathered here today. So, what we want to target here is we want to arm our audience with, as I framed it, facts, not feelings. Because, we all have been, basically bombarded with these messages from corporations ranging from, I guess probably Ben & Jerry's probably put out the most, targeted, really kind of on message, really, about, specific, discrimination towards Blacks. I think they've been probably, the most specific to, the messages about social injustice and, the all lives matter type stuff coming from corporations. So, I think that, where you wanted to start this is that, we want to narrow in and make sure that this is really what we're talking about here is about discrimination against Black people. So I'm going to let you take it from there about how to basically keep these discussions on message.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge is that, historically there seems to be an anathema to talking about Black specific issues, right? And what happens is that it's almost as if our presence is conditional upon really not speaking on that. It's almost as if it's insulting to people in the room, or it's incendiary or beyond the pale in some way, shape, or form, right? And that's always been a challenge. There's a lot of the work that I've done in the book is about shifting that paradigm so people understand the need for specificity. And there's this idea of, it can't be Black, it has to be all, right? Or it can't be Black, it has to be like a minority diverse, type of conversation. So, what we all have to remember is, what's really kind of driving this. You've got this massive, COVID-19 pandemic that has both an extraordinary economic impact as well as a health impact. And it started off as an equal opportunity epidemic, right? That's how it was advertised. That's how it was discussed. And then you started to see that, wow, it's actually, massively disproportionately ravaging, right, the Black community, right? And I think the numbers are underreported because the testing wasn't sufficient enough to actually capture all the deaths associated with it. So that's a massive issue. You also, have alongside of that, these really grotesque public executions, right, that were done by the police, two of which were captured on video, right? That was really shocking. And one of the things that those videos did not allow for. It did not allow for the blaming of the victim, right? There is a underlying bias, right, that where there is perceived, negativity associated with Black people. And then there's also trying to find ways to confirm that bias. You couldn't do it, right? When you look at George Floyd, it's just grotesque and evident, right? What you see. And then you're looking at the fact that you've got massive economic deprivation. We're starting to see what the numbers look like right now. So 440,000 Black businesses have been shut down, right? At this point, 40% of Black businesses were in industries most directly affected by this. 40% of Black employees, massively disproportionately frontline, emergency workers, so on and so forth. And then you have this explosion, which to me seems to have pierced the veil, right? Where it is very Black specific. Now, what you start to see is that Black specific issues wind up, evolving into kind of like minority solutions. And what you have to have is you got to have targeted solutions. These are anti-Black issues that are happening. And one of the ways, like I tried to explain that to people, even before all of this COVID and all this stuff, right, is even if you think about the importance of specificity, think about like supply chain spend, right? If you think about, this notion of diversity, minority inclusion, all this kind of stuff, generally euphemisms for not white male, right? Extremely broad category. It's about 90% of people on planet Earth. If you look at supply chain spend and you say, all right, let's do more business with women, which is a fantastic, tremendous thing to do. Women spend for businesses that have employees about $1.2 trillion. But if you ask how much of that is from Black women, it's like 2%, right? So it's not until the 99th dollar that a sister sees a dollar, right? If $100 is spent. And then if you say, okay, let's invest and do more with our, Latino brothers and sisters, which people should do, double, triple down on that. They're doing about $380 billion for their businesses that have employees, right? But if you drill down and you say, well, how much of that is Afro-Latinos? It's 2%, right? So again, you have that same kind of dynamic. If you look at, our Asian brothers and sisters, they're doing about $628 billion. By definition, there's no Black people in that group. For Black enterprise with employees, it's about $100 billion. So if you add up the entire group, right, only 4% of that revenue is actually going to Black enterprise. You actually have to be specific, right? You can be extremely well-intentioned, right, and drive a tremendous amount of resources into supply chain spend, but it's not going to get to Black enterprise, right? That's clear. The data is 1,000% clear on that. The question then becomes, well, why is that, right? And there are multiple reasons, right? But one of the things that people have to understand is, yes, there is anti-group bias. Each of those groups does face bias and discrimination, but they're not equal levels of bias and discrimination, right? The highest levels are to Black people, institutions, and businesses. And the other thing that's really important for people to understand is that the rate at which those biases are falling over time is much is the slowest for Black businesses and for Black people. And your ability to accumulate wealth is directly proportional to the amount of discrimination that you face from the dominant group, right? So we like to believe that we live in an egalitarian world, and we're kind of told that we do, and the only differences are just kind of hard work and stick-to-itiveness. But that is just not, the fact pattern on the ground. That was the case before COVID, right? Now, with all of the devastation associated with COVID, you have to have Black specific solutions, because you will pump in massive amounts of money, but it's going to go to minority diverse type of solutions. And the business infrastructure is quite different. You know what I mean? If pre-COVID, if you looked at like how much capital, right, or deposits are in like these minority institutions, if you added them all up, diverse, banks, 2.5% of all those assets will be from Black banks. So, our Asian brothers and sisters have $100 billion in the bank, right? Or Latino brothers and sisters have $100 billion approximately. For Black people in Black banks, it's about 4.7 or so billion. So your ability to self-finance and to shield yourself from kind of that resonant level of discrimination is dramatically hampered by those differences, right? And the capital that's available. So as much as we would like to think that things are the same, I mean, there's some massive structural differences, and it's necessary that you have very targeted, plans. And I start with the impression that all these folks are actually have good intentions, and I know there are nefarious people there, but I start with they have good intentions and they want good outcomes, but they're just not designed. The solutions are not designed to deliver that.
Another thing that we talked about earlier this week, you said about the whole, this myth that we live in an egalitarian society, right? So I posed this, this conversation to you that I had one of my booth classmates, and that he had, one of my booth classmates that is, not Black, that he posed this question to. To a white woman that, asking her like, well, why don't you go shop? Why don't you live in a Black? And this white person's response was, well, because, poor, uneducated Blacks are scary, right, to white people. And I told you that my response was, so, that's all that lives in Black neighborhoods, is, poor, uneducated Blacks. So, because again, the assumption is that there is no Black middle class, right? So, your response to this was that, the Black middle class, like I said, is largely invisible in America. And you're saying that you basically gave me this data point about how effectively, it doesn't matter really how much more education that we get, that it doesn't necessarily increase our, it doesn't make us more desirable to employers. So if you could talk about that.
Yeah, so we could talk about it on a couple of different dynamics. So if you think about like from the real estate end of it, right? There have been surveys that have been done that said, listen, if you can get a home that has all of the attributes that you want, so the rooms, the size, the amenities, right? The school system, the things that we deeply care about, right? But if it is in a Black community, they don't want it, right? So the other challenges is, there's studies that say if you're, like a woman with a perfect driving record, your insurance premiums in a Black middle class community is almost 200% higher than it would be in a white community, right? You have the issue that we saw from some analysis that was done at Booth, way back when we were there, about the how you increase the quality, right, and strength of resumes. And they saw that when the person perceived it to be a white person, the increase in desirability went up by 30%. When it was same thing, but it was, perceived to be a Black person, it was statistically no difference, right, in increase in the desire to call this person back or, for employment. And you actually needed 8 years of incremental experience to be able to overcome that, right? There was another study that was also done by this, public-private group that looked at speaking directly to employers, which I thought was brilliant, asking what skill sets they desire and that they want. And if they could bring people who had those skill sets, right, would they be interested in hiring them? And they said, yeah, absolutely. So they went and they found folks and they created a year-long program specifically to develop the skill sets, right, that were identified by the employers, the offtake partners. And what they saw at the end of that 1 year, that even though the skill set, right, had increased across the board by all the participants, the employment rates went up for every single person, in that group, except the Black participants, right? Now, what this is speaking to is, and I talk about this in the book to set the scene here, we are dealing with very high existing levels of anti-Black bias, right? And it is like the 900-pound, elephant that's in the room that no one is talking about, right? And unless you understand that, the program is going to be less effective. You have training programs to develop skill sets, which is fantastic, but then you also have to deal with the fact of the desirability of the candidate themselves, right? Is there an indication of your Blackness, whether it's your name, whether it's some way to perceive the melanin in your skin, whether it's the the accent, right, or that you have, that kind of gives away to things that might trigger that bias. And one of the things we need to make people understand is that this exists, right? And places like Yale and Stanford and Michigan and lots of terrific schools have identified this, right? So that when our peers and superiors and subordinates, are encountering that there are challenges, they don't automatically assume that we must be, kind of, overstating, the situation, because it simply can't be about race. Unfortunately, the base state, the normal state, is something called automatic white preference, right? If you do nothing, the bias is towards whiteness, right? You have to actually do so, which means it's against blackness, and this is exhibited in all these groups, which means you actually have to do something proactive to be able to counteract for that.
Exactly. So, one more question before we start talking about solutions, and I just wanted to address this because of media, and I know that you have some thoughts on this. So, there was a graphic I sent you earlier this week that's on Fox News about Bob Johnson's number that he put forth about reparations, and his number is 14.7 trillion, right? And that basically give a check for roughly about 350,000 and some change to basically every African American in the U.S. So, what are your thoughts on that? How he arrived at that number, and how this compares to the research that you've done, and basically what your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So the first thing is that I was surprised that he proposed it, right? I like that he proposed it because he put it on the table in a big way, right? He's a successful business man. He's a billionaire. He's got this long legacy. He's someone with credibility, right? So he put it on the table for discussion, and I like that aspect of it very much. The other thing that I like very much is that if he wants to, he can keep this in play for a long time because he has the wherewithal to be able to push out a media campaign to keep it at the forefront, right? And what you need are these conversations becoming normalized, right? As opposed to be these kind of fringe thought processes. I had a couple of immediate thoughts that jumped out. One of my first thought was, I think that's more for Jim Crow than it is for slavery itself. Slavery is a much larger, number than that. The other piece that kind of jumped out to me was the cash payment, right? Because we have such a limited business infrastructure right now, and because of bias levels that exist, about 98% of what our collective income is spent on non-Black enterprise, right? So it's entirely possible for the vast majority of that to be spent on various levels of non-Black enterprises. It'll be extremely stimulative in just about everybody else's community, and it might not be very stimulative, in our community at all. And I have, great concerns about that. And the other piece of it was that, we need a far more robust business infrastructure to be able to circulate that through to get this multiplier effect that people are, always talking about. We don't, there's always the issue, right, of inflation, right? And I'm a student of history, and I know we're operating in a system that is reacting to what we are doing, right? And it's reacting in a way that's based on containment, right? When there's a perceived amount of progress. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of clever ways and unintended consequences that can be very negative for Black people that I think we need to be thinking about, planning for, and being able to, to mitigate, right? And when I try to help people understand, I say, well, why would you think the number is small? And by the way, I'm not against reparations at all, right? I've always thought reparations was going to happen, right? The value of the 4 million people held in bondage in 1860 is about $22 trillion, right? And I can come up with that 4 different ways, right? The first way is, economists say, it's between 16 and 20% of U.S. wealth, right? That was the equivalent at that time, right? So pre-COVID, that would have been 14 to 17 trillion. U.S. wealth is 85 trillion. You split that, and it's 15.5. The other way of calculating it is by GDP. 1 to 2 years of GDP is what those people were worth, right, to the country. 1 to 2 years of that is 19 to 38 trillion pre-COVID, right? You take an average of that, we're at 28.5. You take an average of those two things, you're at 22, right? If you look at it from what John Clay did, or Henry Clay did back in the 1830s in the U.S. Senate, he said they were worth about $1.2 billion, right? If you look at what Thomas Piketty says about slave-based returns, they're somewhere between 5 and 7%. If you just use those numbers, you're going to come up with about $22 trillion. And then if you go back to the early 1810s, Thomas Jefferson and Madison also came up with a pricing structure. They thought it was 1%, not 1%, but 1 year of national income. Again, that would be about $19 trillion, or the equivalent of selling 1/3 of all public land at the time, right? Because they were all trying to figure out either the possibility or impossibility of being able to compensate the slave owners, right? So the value of these folks is $22 trillion. It's enormous, right? It's massive. They're what they produce in terms of raw cotton was 61% of U.S. exports. And they dominated 80% of the global market in cotton, right? And that's the equivalent of oil. 20 million people employed in that during that time. 1 million of those people lose their jobs upon the Civil War. I mean, it was a big, massive deal. It cannot be separated from the country. There is no way the present is possible without that extraction, right, and deprivation.
So given a historical context, and again, like I said, our point here is to give people data,
yep,
to really kind of arm them with, for having these discussions with people, in your companies or anyone who comes into your purview, to really kind of understand. One, there's a discussion about, we want to focus in on Black issues, and two, really understanding the economic impact that our people have had on building this country. So the third phase is like, we don't talk about problems, we talk about solutions.
Yep.
So I want you to explain to people about PhD.
Okay. So
and as you said, like how it can be implemented all the way from policy to personal.
Yep. So in the book, I talk about the past, right? The cumulative effect of the past. I talk about this tax in the present. Then the final part of it, I talk about this economic framework that I call PhD, which is purchase, hire, and deposit in ways that create jobs, create and expand businesses, and provide capital in the Black community. And that was because we had these massive gaps in 1.4 million jobs of businesses that were missing. We had a massive gap in jobs. 6 million jobs were missing across the broader Black community. And of course, there's a gargantuan gap in terms of net wealth, right, relative to our white peers, which is over $9 trillion, right? So this PhD notion is meant to drive jobs, revenue, and provide capital. So from a personal level, the P is purchase, right? So that's, on a personal level, that's what you choose to buy or consume, right? You don't need permission to do that. So if you're, buying a home, do you use a Black realtor, right? Because you got to pay the transaction costs anywhere. If you have to insure it, do you use a Black insurer, right? If you're going to fix up the basement, kitchen, whatever associated with it, do you consider using Black contractors, right? If you're going to kind of make it a smart home, do you use, Black service providers that can help you do that, right? These are massive, really big ticket items. Is it possible for you to use, financial institutions that are Black owned or provide opportunities within the Black community? Huge, massive, really big ticket items, right? When you think about the cars that you buy, right? You have total control over that. 16,000 auto dealers pre-COVID, 264 are Black. We buy 5 million cars on a year, on an annual basis, right? Massive, gargantuan amount of money. Almost none of that is with Black dealers. Should be 2,000 Black dealers, right? If we shifted our spend to those folks, that alone would create 130,000 jobs, right? So, and do we put our money in Black financial institutions so that they have more lending, right? So that they can loan, and then their returns are more attractive because 70% of all bank revenue is driven by the lending associated with it. And that would also help attract the tier one capital that they would need to kind of upgrade the infrastructure associated with it. You don't need Congress, you don't need laws, you don't need any of that stuff to do that. We spend $1.2 trillion a year on total. When possible, where possible, utilize high quality, Black talent, right? And products and services. For corporations, that's a supply chain, right? So what is our presence in their supply chain? And if you look at it at a corporate level, if you look at it at a governmental level, Black firms are less than 2% at all levels, right? Federal, state, local, as well as, for corporations in general. And being in a supply chain, that can create 10, 15,000 jobs, right? In various communities with small movements in terms of how things are allocated. And then, what from governments and corporations, like what are they doing from a PhD standpoint? How are they making sure that Black people are properly represented on their payrolls, right, at meaningful levels across the board, and also in their supply chain? And are they providing liquidity, right, whether it's through their own captive internal financing corporations or what they're doing with the money that they have themselves, or how they can influence their bank, relationships, right? Because at the end of the day, PhD is driving employment, business development and creation, and making, liquidity and capital available. In terms of, and you can do that with yourself. You can do it in the institutions, companies that you influence, your alma maters, the gigantic, multi-billion-dollar institutions. Nobody ever thinks about what the supply chain is for the universities that they went to, right? They just kind of think about what's a Black representation in terms of the student body and the professors, and not the 10 to 15 people behind each professor. And then you can also extend this into policy, right? So when people are saying, look, I'm interested in your vote, you say, oh, that's fantastic, right? I'd love to rock with you, right? Show me your plan for PhD. Show me how this policy plan, strategy, proposal is going to generate jobs, business, and provide capital in the Black community specifically, right? I'm happy that you're creating economic opportunities for everyone or for other people, but I need to know what your plan is here, right? And those are questions that we rarely seem to ask, right? And then what we wind up getting, if you're not specific, what you're going to wind up getting is something that I call lies, right? Which are low impact economic solutions. And I think the time for that is past, right? No more lies. Be very specific. Yes, you should vote. You should vote according to what your economic interests are, right? We cannot have the thriving communities that we want based on gaps in jobs, businesses, and capital availability. It simply is not possible, and we need solutions tiered to that, right? It helps to depersonalize everything, right? It's very clear. You just kind of lay out what your expectations are. They see how their plans align with it. If their plans don't, we can help them create one, right? Help me help you, right? And if you have a plan, then that's fantastic. Then we can go to a higher level of conversation, which is, how would you implement this plan, right? And by the way, how much of this could be done by executive order? And by the way, how much of this is going to be, can you do in the first 2 years? Because it's a wrap after that, right? When the midterm elections come and you start to get into those practicalities of down select. And oh, by the way, if you want another term, how did you deliver on what you said that you were going to do? But you have to have very clear, well-defined interests. You have to have a framework to be able to judge the efficacy of what you're doing as an individual, what you're doing as as some type of collective or entity, and what your representatives, right, are doing. And that kind of framework is what's needed, and what I don't see.
On mute. Very comprehensive. Thank you very much. So actually that brings us to time, but I will go to the chat. There's a lot of conversation going on here. We have a question. How do we encourage members of the Black community who may be apprehensive to join us in our economic plan?
I would say, first thing, I don't mean to be like self-aggrandizing. Point them to our the videos and the talks and stuff that I've done kind of online. and give them a copy of the book. It lays out the whole fact pattern in the case, right? We're all dealing with levels of anti-Black bias. We're all dealing with levels of concern about what's really achievable and the like. And we need something to help people with the paradigm shift. We cannot work on the what if a bunch of people are still focused on the why. And I've really done that work to be able to turbocharge that, whether it's your boss, your colleagues, or whatever. It's written in this plain language that's based on data. It's recognized kind of across the board. It has the same impact that can cut down, on a lot of that.
Question: if we have these, if these sessions will be on playback, the answer to that is yes. But Shawn specifically has a tremendous body of work as far as his talk on YouTube. I mean, I think there's at least 4, 5, 6 that I can think of. The one that he did at Google is probably the most comprehensive, I think. But I mean, you can just search for him on YouTube. But he has a lot of videos out there. The book is a very easy read. So I definitely encourage everyone to pick up the book. His website, I will drop it in the chat, but it is the Black Tax.
www.blacktaxed.com.
So I recommend you pick up the book, or but also take a minute to just watch his videos. You have a request here for Winnie Paris to speak to the Guyanese Black Entrepreneurs Group. But yeah, I mean, look, it's and again, natural bias here. Like I said, me and Shawn go way back, the whole chemical engineer booth data thing. This is a data-driven approach, proven. We're solutions-driven here. So again, I think as you said, you put you put the truth in front of people, and I think it just naturally resonates with them. PhD, purchase, hire, deposit. I think it's the way to go. So. And Brian is doing a Sandman on us right now, saying our session is over in less than 1 minute. So, Shawn, I want to thank you. This is awesome. As always. So again, I encourage everyone to take the website, theblacktax.com. Look up his information on YouTube as well. And thank you again.
Thanks, Laura. I appreciate it.
National Association of Real Estate Brokers wants to have you as well. So thank you.
I took my L, I kept it pushing, I can't break for that. They tried to count me out, I told them it's too late for that.